we can get going. Sarah, are you ready?
Yep.
So delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Sarah Charak to give a shiur for us this evening. Sarah is, amongst other things, a very good friend of mine, always has incredibly insightful Torah and more general ideas to share and discuss. And, you know, I feel really privileged to say that Sarah is my friend, and some of the conversations that we've had have really been thoughtful, thought-provoking, informative in some ways for me as well. Sarah, do you want me to give you a bio about like where you've learned and all the things you've done?
I don't know if that's necessary.
That's not necessary. Okay, we won't do that. But just to say, you know, I'm sure that this evening's session is going to be incredibly interesting and powerful and meaningful. Thank you very much for joining us, Sarah. And thank you, Or Hadash, as well.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks, Avi. And thanks to Blake Street generally, and to my own shul, Or Hadash, for this opportunity. And a special thanks to Yafa for the nudging to get the info to her and to respond to her. Thank you for that work. So I'm Sarah, and I'll do my own little bio, but I'm a law student by day, writing my second honors thesis. Maybe a bad idea, who knows? And at other times, I'm a community volunteer and someone who is keen on Talmudic stories. So that is what we're going to do this evening. And so just as a recap for the uninitiated, and before I share my screen, so you can get the source sheet ready, but we'll start with that in a minute. But just as a recap, Talmud is generally made up of two master genres, legal and narrative, or halacha and agada. And I always like to point out that neither of these genres constitutes a formal or analytic philosophy or ethics. So in fact, rigorous Jewish philosophy and writings on ethics only came to the fore in the Middle Ages, beginning with people like Sadi Gaon and Maimonides, early Middle Ages period. So the rabbis of the Talmud, which is where we're going to situate ourselves, use narrative, if anything, to convey their sort of take on various theological and ethical questions, such as the story we're going to learn together. And I think narrative in many ways is a more flexible way to deal with ethics than an analytical essay, because you can have different characters convey different approaches. So it's more similar to, if anyone's done this at uni or in other contexts, philosophers like Plato, who wrote philosophy through dialogue. And what I think is most interesting is the way that narrative in the Talmud can be really subversive or rebellious. So we have to remember that Talmudic stories are written by people who were scholars. They're proponents of Torah learning. That's what they did with most of their time. And yet there are lots of stories that seem to criticize that enterprise of Torah learning, or at least stories that warn the reader of the dangers of intellectualism or the weaknesses that can come with detached, strictly legal thinking. And I think that's an important theme to keep in mind when we read the story. So what are the authors really trying to tell us? And if the characters seem to represent different values, which is the one preferred by the author? And there might not be a straightforward answer to that question. So I'm aware that none of what I've said so far is about Elul or the Yamim Noraim or Teshuva, but we'll get there, I promise. So now I will just share my screen, and I will say that, so that should have worked. And you should all also be able to see, you should be able to open the source sheet if you prefer to control what's going on with the source sheet yourself. And I will say that we've allowed, the settings should be that you can all unmute yourselves. And ask some questions, hear what people think at different points of the story. Generally, when I teach, it's like chavruta style and we're learning together. It's a little bit hard to replicate over Zoom, but we will try. And I will rely on my various family members to fill any awkward silences that ensue. Okay, cool. So the context is as follows. The story we're going to learn appears actually also not in the place we're going to learn it from, but also in Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is a Midrashic compilation. But we're going to learn the version that appears in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Tanit. So in Masechet Tanit, Tanit means the word means fast, and it's specifically focused on the fasts which would be decreed in ancient Israel if the rain didn't come at the right time. Now, that actually has nothing to do with the story that we're going to learn, because as is common with Talmud, when we get to page 20a, which is where we start, we're on a tangent. And this tangent is about blessings and curses. So we start with a statement, which is classic of rabbinic analysis, which is going to turn two biblical texts on their heads. And it goes as follows. Tova klala shekilel achia hashiloni et Yisrael yoter mibracha sheberchan Bilaam harasha. So the curse with which Achia the Shilonite cursed the Jewish people is better than the blessing with which Bilaam the wicked blessed them. So what seemed like a curse and a blessing are actually going to turn out to be opposites. So what was Achia's supposed curse? So Achia Shiloni kilalan bekaneh. So Achia the Shilonite cursed the Jewish people by comparing them to a reed. And the verse that he uses goes, for the Lord will smite Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. And that does seem like potentially a bad thing. But although it seems like a curse, this verse is actually a blessing. Why is that? Ma kaneh ze omed bimkom mayim v'giz'o machlif v'sharashav merubin v'afilu kol haruchot sheba'olam ba'ot v'noshvot bo ein mezizot oto mimkomo ela holech uva imahen damamu haruchot amad hakaneh bimkomo. So this reed stands in a place of water. That's a good thing in sort of Jewish constructions, like water is always positive, and it's the place that the reed gets its life from. And its shoots replenish themselves when cut, so it regrows, and its roots are numerous. And even if all the winds in the world come and blow against it, they cannot move it from its place. Rather, it sways with them until the winds subside, and the reed still stands in its place. And so the same thing applies to the Jewish people. So although this seems to be a curse, this verse is really a blessing. Like a reed, after all the difficulties that the Jewish people endured, they will ultimately survive. And the reed, because it's able to move in the wind, doesn't fall over. So now we turn to Bilaam's blessing. Now, if you remember the story, this is also kind of a Bilaam's supposed blessing was to compare the Jewish people to a cedar. And what he says is, as they're like cedars beside the waters. Now, that might be, we might think that's a good thing, especially because cedars grow tall and they're quite impressive looking. But it turns out this is actually a curse because unlike a reed, a cedar doesn't have its roots in water. And also, ve'ein gizol machalif, ve'ein sharashav merubin. So also its shoots don't replenish themselves and its roots are not numerous. So Bilaam wanted the same thing to apply to the Jewish people. In other words, not be rooted and not be kind of strong in the way that the reed is. And more significantly, afilu kol haruchot sheba'olam noshvot bo ein mezizot oto mimkomo. So most winds in the world won't move the cedar from its place, but kevan shenashva bo ruach dromit, when a particularly strong southerly wind comes along, or karto v'hofachto al panav, it uproots the cedar and turns it on its face. And so although cedars can grow to an enormous height, their roots are not strong or numerous, and they can be uprooted by this strong southerly wind. So what we have here is a comparison between the flexibility, or we might say the resilience of the reed, and the immovability of the cedar. But now the Talmud goes further to praise the reed. And sorry that I wasn't scrolling, but here we are. So we're up to our third little box over here. So so there's this other reason why a reed is a really good thing. And that is that a reed is what we use to make a quill to write a Torah, and not only Torah scrolls, but also scrolls of Nevi'im and Ketuvim, prophets and writings. So now finally, after that intro about reeds and cedars, 11 minutes into this shiur, we'll get to some actual narrative, which is a really exciting bit. So obviously we're on the topic of reeds and cedars. And so the rabbis of the Talmud step in now and they're going to tell a story that is relevant to that. So Tana Rabbanan, our rabbis taught, Le'olam yehei adam rach kekaneh v'al yehei kasher ke'erez. A person should always be rach, and you could translate that in a number of ways, but let's say for now soft, so soft like a reed, and not kasher, so stiff or hard like a cedar. And what's the story that proves this? Ma'aseh sheba Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon mimigdal gador mibeit Rabbo v'haya rachuv al chamor u'mitayel al sfat nahar. So this is our opening scene, and it's quite idyllic. An incident occurred where this guy, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, interestingly, in the version in Avot Rabbi Natan, he's actually called Rabbi Shimon, but here we'll call him Rabbi Elazar. He came from Migdal Gador, which was his rabbi's house. And he was riding on a donkey and strolling on the bank of a river and probably having a very nice time. And in fact, it tells us that. V'sameach simcha gdola, he was very happy. V'haita da'ato gasa alav, and his head was swollen with pride, mipnei shelamad Torah harbeh, because he had studied much Torah. And where had he studied this Torah? Well, he's just coming from his rabbi's house. So that's like the kind of scene that's set. And you could imagine it if it was a movie, that you'd have very wide angle, because you'd be able to see the bank of the river and kind of rolling grasses or whatever. And he's having a really nice time on his own, on his donkey, leaving this spiritual kind of intellectual experience of learning Torah with his rabbi. So on the next page. So nizdamen lo adam echad shehaya mechoar bioter. He happened upon a super ugly person. And this person said to him, Shalom alecha, Rabbi. And this person greeted him very nicely and said, greetings to you, my rabbi. And there's no indication that these two know each other, but he is addressing him with respect. And he seems to know, either from his appearance or from the fact that he's riding on a donkey, or perhaps the way that he's dressed, that he's a rabbi, and so he should be addressed in this way. V'lo hechzir lo, but Rabbi Elazar didn't respond to him at all. Instead, Amar lo, he said, Reika. Now, Reika, we've got translated here as a worthless person, but the word Reik really means empty. So he's calling this person empty straight away. And then says, Kama mechoar oto ha'ish. How ugly is that man? Now, what's really interesting about this is that he's not actually seen, or at least at this point, he's not addressing him directly. So he's objectifying and putting him in the third person here. That man is super ugly. Shema, kol b'nei irecha mechoarin kmotcha. And then he turns to him and says, are all the people of your city as ugly as you? So we'll just pause here, and I will ask people to unmute themselves. So what is it that, what is it that makes Rabbi Elazar respond like this? Why does he behave like the way that he does?
Hello.
Hey.
I noted that, on the page before, it says his head is full of pride from studying Torah, and I feel like that's maybe leading the reader in a sense. You might be full of knowledge after studying Torah, but pride is the attitude he's bringing with him. So there's maybe like feeling of superiority that is, maybe he would look down on anyone who he came across while walking back from his rabbi's house.
I think that's definitely the direction that the author wants us to go in. What I think is interesting is that this is not just any person, and there's not a general attitude of superiority, but he's really focused on this man's appearance. So let's kind of push that further. Like, what would it be about his pride or about where he's just come from that makes him respond in this particular way?
For me, can be heard, but he's experiencing this reverie, which includes this visual sort of ideal, and this guy jars with that.
Yeah. So one of the suggestions part of the analysis that I should have said this before is from, and I think Tommy's in this call, Tommy Sterling, maybe, who shared with me some pictures,
Yes.
chapter, hi Tommy, from Jeffrey Rubenstein's book, which is, Jeffrey Rubenstein's a fantastic scholar of rabbinic literature, and he's analyzed this story. And one of the suggestions that he brings before getting to Donnie's point about the Torah study and the pride is that you could imagine that it's just the shock of encountering someone that's so dissonant with against the beautiful landscape that he's experiencing and the nice time that he's having. And so it's almost like it slipped out inadvertently, right? That this is just like a kind of immediate reaction to the shock of the level of, and I mean, it's left to our imagination. Like, we only know from Rabbi Elazar that this man's ugly. We actually don't get a real description of him, except to know that he's ugly, but we don't know what that means. But in whatever it means, it's something that's really confronting and sort of maybe strange to Rabbi Elazar. So maybe there's an element of involuntariness to this. Any other ideas? I guess so I do think that, like, as a starting point, we might say, like I said, it slipped out inadvertently. It's an unthinking sort of spontaneous reaction. And it is a little bit relatable because most of us can't help reacting in certain ways to seeing certain things. And it might be desire when we see food that looks particularly tasty, or it might be awe when we see something that looks beautiful, or a certain amount of revulsion when we see something that looks jarring or unpleasant or ugly, whatever that means. The thing is, though, we normally screen those sensibilities and keep them inside our heads, like we have a filter. So we could say maybe Rabbi Elazar is a sort of person who doesn't have that filter, or he doesn't have the social skills to know that what he's thinking is not what he should actually say out loud. And so maybe, or maybe he thinks as soon as it slips out of his mouth, he thinks, I can't believe I actually said that out loud. And maybe he's annoyed at himself, but we don't know that yet. And as we heard, as another option might be that he's just irritated that the man's like interrupted his sort of quiet stroll, and that the ugliness of the man has sort of shattered his enjoyment of his surroundings. But I do think that Donnie's original point is probably where the narrator's taking us, that he's just come from learning. But let's develop that a little bit. What could it be about his Torah learning that makes him respond like this to an ugly person? Is it just a general sense of superiority?
Well, you kind of hope that he hasn't found anything in Torah that justify being so mean to somebody.
Yeah, so I think the author's trying to make us question what is the sort of Torah that he's been learning, that this is his first, as far as we know, this is his first interaction with a human being outside of the Beit Midrash. And this seems to be like what he's taken from his Torah learning. And that's what we were saying in the beginning about there's an implied critique here of the enterprise of Torah learning, if this is the result that it creates. So if we just think some context for what did learning look like in Talmudic times? So scholars used to actually spend like weeks, months, and sometimes even years at a time away from home studying in big Babylonian yeshivot. And this is what he's returning from it. So it's a long period of study involving like intense devotion. And he might even feel a sense of self-sacrifice, that he's given up a lot to do this sort of learning. So that's, I think, where the sense of self-worth comes from. Of course, for Rabbi Elazar, it seems to be exaggerated. So the impact of his Torah study is that he becomes arrogant and sort of puffed up, maybe because of his perceived intellectual prowess. And one option might be that he actually, the way that the man seems to have identified him as a scholar, it might be that he's identified the man as not a scholar. So in other words, there's a snobbiness about like, I'm an intellectual and you're not an intellectual. And that's what he means by the ugliness, potentially.
Sarah.
And a sense of superiority. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. Continue to.
No, go for it, please.
I just wanted to share, and I apologize if you're going to get there at some point, but I find it interesting that the place that he lived in is called Migdal Gedor. Cut me off if you want to.
No, go for it, please.
Okay, so Migdal Gedor actually appears nowhere else. It's not a physical location. It doesn't show up anywhere else in Shas. And Migdal Gedor, literally, a Migdal is a tower, and Gedor is a fenced-in area. So what would we call that? What would be a great way in our kind of modern parlance?
Yeah, so he's coming back to an ivory tower now.
There you go, an ivory tower.
Yeah. So exactly. And I think what we want to develop here is so there's the ivory tower sense, and thank you, Rav Sendorf, for bringing that out so powerfully. There's a sense of intellectual snobbery, but I'm not sure that properly explains why you might insult a person's appearance. It might explain turning to a person and saying, insulting them for their perceived lack of that intellectual prowess and learning. I think that his sense of superiority is also emphasized by the fact that he's on the donkey and the man is obviously not on a donkey. And so you could imagine him like craning his neck to look up at Rabbi Elazar. So I guess part of the ivory tower thing is just being disconnected from the complexities and realities of life. I think there's something deeper though. There's a perception in this learning world that Torah is perfect, and there's a pursuit of perfection. And I think that is part of what doesn't allow Rabbi Elazar to properly process or countenance imperfection in the real world. Yeah, Mandy, go for it.
Is it also about like a frankness in the way that the rabbis speak to each other? If there's a
Yeah.
no-holds-barred kind of culture?
Yeah. So what do you mean by that?
Well, that the pursuit of Torah is bigger than any person's sort of ego or sensibilities, or so you can just say what you want if it's to get to a Torah truth.
Yes. So if the pursuit is truth and perfection, then maybe people's feelings don't matter in the way, but also that, and this is true of my experience of Torah learning, that there's a glorification of argument and sometimes of insults in the context of argument that is potentially also being critiqued here, that it's okay in a Beit Midrash context to turn to a person and say, well, that's not just, I don't think you're right, but that's stupid, and there are all sorts of convoluted yeshivish sorts of ways that people criticize each other, and in fact, Rishonim criticize each other as well, and each other's ideas in ways that are potentially like not the way that academics express disagreement today. Yeah, so I agree, definitely, Maggie. Yeah, Galit.
I was going to say the story kind of reminds me of the story of Rabbi Shimon coming out of the cave and seeing the workers in the field, and maybe not even in an intentional sense, but he views anyone outside of that learning environment, or like he comes out into the world and anything that's mundane to him is like inherently ugly or lesser than like studying Torah.
Yeah, and what's so powerful about that story, I mean, it's even more so than here, is that he actually burns things with his eyes. There's this strange like capacity, magical capacity that he has when he leaves his little Torah bubble and encounters the realities of the world. So that's what I meant in the beginning about there's actually a whole series of these stories that seem to question or at least warn about the dangers of Torah study that's disconnected from the real world and from real people's emotions and emotional needs. So, all right, so that's Rabbi Elazar, and that's definitely already the implied critique from the author. And so if we move on then to the response from the man. So part of what I think is so powerful about the response we're going to read is that if part of Rabbi Elazar's implied critique is not only that you're physically ugly, but that I think you're lesser because you haven't learned what I've learned, then it's really powerful that the response that comes from this ugly man is a very learned answer. In fact, it's a theological answer, and it's quite complex. And so it's almost like we're already being his inability to see beyond the man's imperfect appearance is already being undermined as soon as he opens his mouth, because actually he's a very wise person. So what does he say? Amar lo, so because the final question that Rabbi Elazar asked him was, are all the people of your city as ugly as you? So Amar lo, the man said in response, Eini odea, I don't know. And there's an implication there that like the external appearance of the people around him actually just isn't important enough for him to know if they're ugly or if they're as ugly as him or whatever. It's like not something that he thinks about. Ela lech ve'emor le'uman she'asani kama mechoar kli zeh she'asita. But you should go and say to the craftsman who made me, how ugly is the vessel you made? So immediately Rabbi Elazar realizes from this quite short but very wise statement that he's sinned. So what is it? Let's just draw out, like, what is this response? So who's the craftsman and what's the message here?
That if it's Hashem who made me, you need to go and tell him that what he made is not good, or
So firstly, he's like, well, it's not my fault if I'm ugly. Go talk to God, right? But also there's a deeper theological message, and it brings to mind, I think, the description of creation in the book of Bereshit or Genesis, of humanity being created in God's image. So that an insult to the appearance of any human being is an insult to actually to God. And that means and at that moment, Rabbi Elazar realizes, wow, I've done something really wrong. I think it's a really interesting point that Rabbi Elazar is mobilized to realize his mistake by realizing he's offended God, but not necessarily the man in front of him. So I'm not sure, and this is a question we'll ask when we get to the end, like who's learned what lesson by the end, but I think that's really interesting. But I bolded 2 words in the Hebrew or Aramaic on the right-hand side, that Rabbi Elazar had initially addressed the man as reika, meaning worthless, but it comes from the word that means empty. And the man's response is to almost like riff off that sense of emptiness and say, I'm a vessel, and he says a kli, and he's the one who introduces this allegory of a craftsman and a vessel. But the thing about a vessel is, however the outside of a vessel looks, it might work perfectly well to contain what's inside of it. And so what we get here is this sense that Rabbi Elazar has not processed just like a basic message that, don't judge a book by its cover type thing. And the man's drawing that out. And in fact, the Mishnaic version of don't judge a book by its cover in Pirkei Avot uses also the language of vessel. It's al tistakel b'kankan ela b'ma sheyesh b'tocho. So don't look at the outside of a vessel, but look at what the vessel's holding. So it's a different word, kankan and kli, but I think that the reference here is really quite powerful. That the significance of a vessel is that it hides what's inside. So the man's almost saying like, how can you know that I'm empty when you've actually only seen my outside? And ugly vessels might function actually perfectly well.
Yeah.
So,
Sarah,
yes.
Sorry for jumping in. I was just thinking maybe a read of this story could be the man is pointing out to Rabbi Elazar that you've been learning Torah for all this time, but none of it seems to have affected you. You haven't seemed to have internalized any of the sort of moral messages. And maybe there's also a bit of a riff that's going on with the inside vessel, outside vessel, exterior, interior. What is Torah learning if it's not something which gets to the core and affects us? Isn't that the purpose of what you've been spending all your time learning and doing? And maybe that's what slaps him across the face, maybe.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's almost like this encounter has exposed a level of ugliness inside of Rabbi Elazar, which is not obvious from his external, the one who behaves in an ugly way, at least at this point of the story. So definitely. So Rabbi Elazar immediately realizes that what he's done is wrong. And this is where we start to shift towards our kind of Teshuva and forgiveness themes, obviously relevant to the time that we find ourselves in now. And I just actually meant to mention a literary thing. Sorry, I'll go back for 1 second. But one of the things Jeffrey Rubenstein points out that I think is really, really powerful is that, and I didn't bold these words in the Hebrew, but the words reika and mechoar and ircha, although they use different letters technically, all involve very similar sounds. And what the mistake that Rabbi Elazar has made, those 3 words are empty or worthless, mechoar is ugly, and ircha is your city. And so what he's done is conflate those 3 things. He said that you must be worthless because you're ugly, and because you're ugly, everyone around you must be ugly as well. And so it's that sort of illogical conflation of things that is being critiqued here. And I think that that point about the wordplay there is actually quite cool. So anyway, so Rabbi Elazar realizes he's done something wrong. And this is where I think our question shifts to, at what point, if at all, did Rabbi Elazar deserve to be forgiven? So his immediate reaction is to say, well, first, he realizes to himself that he sinned. And then what's the first thing he does? Yarad min hachamor. So it's almost like he's acknowledged that there was this power differential before, and the height of the donkey compared to the person on the floor was sort of drawing out his snobbiness. And this is his way of humbling himself, is he immediately gets down from the donkey. V'nishtatach, and he prostrated himself lefanav, before the man, v'amar lo, and said to him, na'aneti lecha mecholi. I've sinned against you, please forgive me. So there's a whole progression here of actions that might indicate that Rabbi Elazar's really learned. Firstly, he's internalized, he knows he's made a mistake. Then he takes action to humble himself. And then he actually verbalizes, like, I've made a mistake, I've sinned against you, please forgive me. But the man doesn't immediately forgive him. He says, Ani mochelecha ad shetelech leuman she'asani ve'emor lo kama mocha'ar kli zeh she'asita. The man said, I won't forgive you until you go to the craftsman who made me and say, how ugly is the vessel you made? So what do you think at this point of the story? Does Rabbi Elazar deserve forgiveness? And what's the function of the man repeating his point about the craftsman at this point?
At this point, Rabbi Elazar doesn't seem to realise that he's also insulted Hashem. And so he's saying, you've got to go apologise to Hashem, basically.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting reversal of one of the really often quoted sources that we learn about Yom Kippur and atonement, which from Masechet Yoma, which deals with Yom Kippur, which is that Yom Kippur, the day, atones for sins between human beings and God, but it can't atone for sins between human beings because that's something you have to solve amongst yourselves, right? So, but actually the man here is almost saying the opposite. He's saying this, you might think that this was a sin against me, but actually every sin against another person is a sin against God. And you have to actually go, and there needs to be a process between you and God to fully atone for what you've done. Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting because normally we go through that whole idea about Teshuva having to be forgiven by the person that you've wronged. And it's all very easy and easy within your head to apologize to God for the things that are between you and God, but it's much more difficult to face the person that you've wronged. But maybe there's a reversal happening here precisely because we're talking about somebody in the ivory tower. And for the person in the ivory tower, maybe it's easier to seek forgiveness from somebody that you've written off as worthless than it is to inside your ivory tower where it all matters most to you, to apologize to God, who is the being that you encounter most in that world of learning.
I agree there's a reversal, but I would question, I think actually Rabbi Elazar, if he thinks that he's so much better than the man, then the process of humbling himself actually is quite significant, that he's gotten down off his donkey and that he's apologized because he hasn't dug his heels in. But I take your point about the reversal. Yeah, Yafa?
I was going to say actually maybe the opposite, that I don't think he's apologizing to the man specifically. I think that he's actually saying, oh no, I've offended God. And that's the part that he's uncomfortable with. And therefore he's recognizing that he has to go through this part that he's going through now in order to ascertain God's forgiveness. But it's not about the man at all. It's just about him and God.
Right. So the man's almost pointing out that actually he's missed something. And that's sort of what I was alluding to before, that it's when he gets a theological message that he seems to understand he's done something wrong, but potentially not actually acknowledging like the pain that's directly in front of him. So we'll continue because Rabbi Elazar actually sort of gets the point, like he hasn't done enough. And so he continues to try and atone for this mistake. So Hayam Tayel Acharav Ad Shehigia Le'iro. So not only had he gone down off his donkey, seems to leave his donkey behind. I don't know what happened to the donkey, but he walks. Maybe he's leading the donkey with him. Actually, I didn't think about that. Okay, fine. Whatever. The point is, he stays down on the floor and he continues to walk behind the man until they reach Rabbi Elazar's city. So it happens to be, I guess, coincidentally that they're going to the same place. So he's able to do this. But again, he's humbling himself because he's walking behind him and he's walking rather than using the donkey, which would obviously be a much easier way to get there. And we don't have any indication of how long this is, but certainly people lived further away from each other than, let's say, in Caulfield or Bondi. And also it's this sense of we're in the countryside and we're going to a city. So unclear how big that expanse is, but it could be a long way that he's walking by foot. So at this point, when they arrive at the city, there's like another opportunity for forgiveness and for atonement. So the people of the city came out to greet him. Now, who are they greeting? Well, they know Rabbi Elazar because he's the scholar. So they actually have no idea who this other guy is. So they come out to greet Rabbi Elazar. Shalom alecha, Rabbi, Mori. So they call him doubly my rabbi, my master, my master. So that parallels actually the way that the ugly man initially addressed Rabbi Elazar. There's that sense that he's like a publicly recognizable person. So everyone addresses him as Rebbe, although in this case, it's even more emphasized. But then the ugly man, Amar lahem lemiatem korin Rabbi. So he says, like, who are you calling rabbi? Now, it's not clear at this point, like, does he not realize who Rabbi Elazar is, or is he trying to say something deeper? They say to him, well, we're calling that guy who's walking behind you. Amar lahem im zeh rabbi al yirbu kmoto b'Yisrael. If this is a rabbi, may there not be many like him among the Jewish people. So whether or not this is the moment that the man actually realizes who Rabbi Elazar is, or he's actually saying, well, I know who he is, but I don't think he should have the sort of respect that you're giving him. So that I think is a really powerful exchange. But people of the town, all they know about Rabbi Elazar is that he's this great Torah scholar. So they say, Mipnei ma, like why? What did he do? Amar lahem kach v'chach asali. So and so he did to me. Now, what I think is really interesting is we don't know how much the man has actually relayed. We'll come back to that, but he gives them a version of the story of what has transpired. Amrulo, they say to him, Afal pichein, even so, mecholo, you should forgive him. Why? Sha'adam gadol b'torahu, because he's a great Torah scholar. So at this point, we said in the beginning that it's sometimes unclear, like who is the protagonist? Or whose perspective are we supposed to be taking here? And the benefit of these narratives is that there's some moral ambiguity or complexity. So what I want us to think about is at this point, it's very clear previously that Rabbi Elazar is the one who's being critiqued. But at this point, what do we think about the characters in the story? Has anything shifted? And who's really demonstrating more of a moral failing? And I think it's an open question. So I'm not leading us in any particular direction. So Rabbi Elazar has definitely displayed a deeper level of regret and contrition by getting down off the donkey and walking, etc. So should the man have forgiven him or not? Is there still a point to be made? What does everyone think?
Seems like he's seeking something more than an apology. It's like that this shouldn't happen, that he should somehow have a change of attitude about judging people in this way.
Yep. So he wants something more from him.
I think it's interesting that when he arrives in the city and all his people come out, Rabbi Elazar doesn't say a word to anybody. It's all this conversation's taken over by the man that he's following.
Yeah.
I don't know what significance is there.
Well, what do you think about that? Why would he stay quiet? Like he has an opportunity to frame it himself. He could be the one to tell the story and he could say, look, I made a mistake, but also I said sorry. And also like I've done all these things to try and atone, but he actually stays silent. So who's the good, who's in the good here, according to the author or the narrator?
The man
Possibly
without the
Rabbi.
looks.
Oh.
Sorry, who was that? Was that Ari?
Yeah, I just said that possibly Rabbi Elazar, like maybe he's learned his lesson and now he's staying quiet and being cautious before he jumps to speak, and so he's sort of feeling the situation out. And this man is still going on about the fact and isn't able to let go of what happened, and like, you know, no one else was around supposedly when the first interaction happened, and so it was seemingly solved by Rabbi Elazar apologizing.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe him staying silent is another way that he's trying to atone. So he's not being the one to frame it, and he's sort of humbly stepping back and he's allowing the man to frame this interaction and to tell his own story. It's also not, so that's why I alluded to this before. It's not clear if the man has even reported the fact that Rabbi Elazar has apologized. So he's still, and so it's almost like he's giving the man an opportunity to publicly embarrass him as another form of atonement. So what do we think then of the man's behavior here? So Naomi said like he wants something more from Rabbi Elazar, but is it fair what he's asking of him? So what he's actually done now, we don't know how many people are there, but he seems to have basically embarrassed him in front of his whole town by telling this story and made this point that actually, well, maybe he's a rabbi, but like he's not worthy of that title. So is that mean-spirited or gratuitous? Like, is he trying to rub his face in it, or is that warranted?
I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's a good question because sometimes it's really difficult situation to be in, and it's much harder to accept an apology than to give an apology because it's an ambiguous situation. I mean, somebody who's done something wrong and apologize, a very straightforward set of requirements, but accepting an apology is very difficult because there's right, that it's just it's a much more confused situation, and you don't want to validate, the bad, the bad behaviour.
Yeah.
And
And
it's
it's
a much harder process.
Well, it's like they're both stuck because Rabbi Elazar, what else can he really do? Like, it really seems like he's done a lot to kind of humble himself. But on the other hand, like you said, the man's also stuck because he's hurt. He was deeply hurt by this. And whatever Rabbi Elazar has done hasn't taken back the initial hurt. And so you can be in that situation where you're at an impasse, actually. Galit and then Donnie.
I feel like it's interesting because on one hand, from my perspective, the guy is kind of maybe in a way holding him to a higher standard, saying, oh, because you are, this big rabbi, if you behave in this way, like he mentions, like, if this man is a rabbi, may there not be many like him among the Jewish people, right? So like he holds him to this higher standard, but then the flip side is that the people in the town say, because he is this gadol b'Torah, like you should forgive him. Yeah. So I feel like,
we'll get back to the townspeople in a second, but I don't know if what Donnie and Hannah want to say is related to that, but I think it's a good question. Like, are the townspeople right as well in this situation?
Yes, the point. He wants action.
Sorry, I can't tell who's speaking. Oh, Safta, do you want to talk?
Safta wants to say something.
I don't really.
Guys, this is my Safta.
It seems to me that this man who's been called ugly, who's been given an apology is sort of a very shallow thing. He wants to see what this man does with some recognition that he's done wrong. I think that's why the next part is going to actually confirm all that.
Yes.
So he's just waiting to see, is this guy going to do anything with it? Because what Galit just quoted is extremely relevant. He is saying, if this is a rabbi, I hope there aren't many like him amongst the Jewish people. It's just not a way to behave.
Yeah.
And now let's see what he's going to do with it.
Yeah, definitely. Donnie.
I think the point I will make is similar to what your Safta and what Galit said, in that perhaps the man who Rabbi Eliezer's called ugly is saying to the people, like, yes, this man is great and intellectual, but look at how he is at his worst. And perhaps considering that it is important to you, the people of his town, that you also know this about him.
Yeah. So and also what you're saying is then it's not like a public shaming what's going on, but he's actually saying you need to know this about the person who you see.
It's doing so. It calls to mind maybe like recent, like revelations about public figures in like recent times. It's like, sure, they've done all these great things, but like look at who they are behind closed doors when in private or whatever as well.
Yeah, so maybe there's also, he's saying there's a broader failure of leadership here and you need to be aware of this so that you have a full picture of who this person really is. Yeah, Hannah?
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking of it in terms of like the through line of pride that's going in the story. Like, it starts out that this guy is full of pride at his Torah learning. And then it seems like the ugly man, his response is in direct response to that specifically. Like, he's saying, you're so full of your own learning, but I'm an empty vessel. And so it's more about a sort of like self-nullification that this man has. So I'm kind of wondering if this, towards the end, when he's coming into the town, is less about him seeking revenge and more about him trying to make a point or humble and bring down. Like, he's taking everything that this Torah scholar, Rabbi Elazar, is so proud of, like his Torah learning, everything that's valuable to him and makes him who he perceives himself to be, and his calling it into question as a sort of test of like, can you be as empty a vessel as what I am? And the point is not so much about how much you've learned, but about your relationship to God. And it almost answers the question as well of his request that Rabbi Elazar apologize to Hashem and not to him, because it's not about him. It's not about his feelings. He's an empty vessel. It's really the issue of Rabbi Elazar's relationship to God.
Right. So you're saying you might even embrace that sense of being a vessel. And that's a Hasidic concept of like, really, we should nullify ourselves in the face of God, godliness and divinity, and that's a healthy attitude to have. And certainly Rabbi Elazar has none of that humility or self-nullification at all. Yeah, Avi? Rab Avi?
Avi, please. So I'm thinking that about the sort of tension that exists between the words that you've highlighted in bold, that Rabbi Elazar is a great Torah scholar, and that being the reason that therefore people should, that he should be forgiven on the one hand, and on the other hand, like the existence of this story where we're seeing, so there's like this awkwardness and this tension where in the public perception, Rabbi Elazar is a great Torah scholar, and great Torah scholars do the right thing, and we need to have this public perception that they need to be forgiven because they've done the right thing. But then this very story is in the Talmud, this very story has been preserved by our tradition, and it's highlighting that great Torah scholars, whatever that means, definitely don't always do the right thing. And it's this like awkwardness where we're being upfront and honest that we want, we acknowledge that our leaders are flawed, but at the same time, like that in the public perception, there's this idea that they shouldn't be flawed.
Yes. And I think that's, so I definitely agree. And I guess if that people have other comments about the townspeople's reaction, I am very interested in that, because are they saying, like Avi seems to be implying, that he should be forgiven because we need to preserve an image of our leaders as being perfect? Or he should be forgiven because we give him the benefit of the doubt, because the fact that he's a Torah scholar must mean that there must be some logical explanation for what looks like bad behavior. You know, he must have had a reason for this, or he didn't mean it. So there's like maybe a sort of justification going on. And I think it's a very familiar dynamic when we come to how we relate to community or political leaders who seem to have not lived up to our expectations of them.
Or maybe there's a third possibility, which is, but it's a bit tortured, but maybe we get there. Maybe there's also, he's such a great Torah scholar, surely he will realise what he's done, and surely his apology is genuine. So to Safta's point, that maybe with some people you'd think the apology was shallow, but this one's a great Torah scholar, so surely he's now going to do the right thing and follow through.
Yeah, but does the narrator or the author think that that's a fair assumption? So the townspeople think that he should be forgiven maybe at a lower bar to other people because of the position that he occupies, or because we give him the benefit of the doubt and we assume like really he's a good person. But what does the author think of that? That's what Avi was sort of alluding to.
Well, you think he should know better actually because he's a Torah scholar.
Yeah.
Like,
so really they're saying let's lower the bar. Standard. Exactly. So I think that's sort of the author is questioning that Adam Gadol B'Torah, what do we expect of a person like that? Are we saying, oh, when we make it easier for them, the standards are lower, or the standards actually supposed to be much higher? And I think that the narrator is hinting at the latter while the townspeople are voicing the former. And I think that tension is a really interesting one. So if we move to, I think Miri was going to say something, but then she put her hand down. So I guess we'll leave it unless you want to jump in, Miri. No? Cool. Okay. So at the conclusion of the story, which is really, really powerful, and it also links us back in a beautiful kind of literary way to our opening in a way that Talmudic stories often do. So the man gets almost the last word. He gets the last word in the interaction with the townspeople. They say, we should forgive Rabbi Elazar because he's a Torah scholar. So Amar Lahem, he said to them, Bishvilchem hareini mochel lo. So for your sake, I will forgive him. But then he puts a condition on it. Ubilvad shelo yehei ragil la'asot kain. As long as he accepts upon himself not to become accustomed to behave like this. And the way that that's translated is to reflect that word ragil in Hebrew, or in Mishneh Hebrew, is to do something on a regular basis. Now the Chidushei Agadot, which is just one commentary, jumps on this and says that the man didn't actually say Ubilvad shelo ya'aseh kain, that he shouldn't do this again, but that he shouldn't become accustomed to doing this. So what's being asked then of Rabbi Elazar by the man? What's his final request? Like, this is the moment that he has to say, this is what you need to do to really earn my forgiveness.
To make some effort to change.
Yeah. So to change his like to cultivate certain personality traits. So it's not only that you need to prove that you won't do this again, but you need to not be accustomed to doing this. So you need to address these underlying characteristics, this arrogance, this snobbiness, the kind of sense of puffed up self-worth that is what allowed you to blurt that out in the first place, whether it was voluntary or not. So, and then we get, so that's the final word in the exchange with the townspeople. But then miyad, straight away, Avi, do you want to go before we do the last line?
Yeah, I was just thinking that something that's part of that as well is that it's not that you don't have to do it again. So the way that Naomi was interpreting it is that it's a higher bar. You need to do more than just never do it again. You need to set yourself up to be accustomed to never doing it again. But I think there's also a way that it can be read as a lower bar, which is that you're allowed to fail. Sometimes you don't never have to do it again. You're allowed to fail occasionally as long as you're making those broad efforts. And I think that, certainly trying to, take that lesson for Teshuva for myself, that's something that I carry with me.
I think that's really powerful that on the one hand, it's a higher bar to not be accustomed to do this, so address the underlying causes, but also that we will fail. And the problem is not making the mistake or doing the thing. The problem is, what is it that allows us to make the mistake, and are we addressing those underlying causes? So I think that's a really powerful message here. So Rabbi Elazar has learned this message on some level based on what he next says. So miyad, immediately. So now he's gotten back to his own city, and I think it actually is interesting, the different placement. So as Rav Sender pointed out, Migdal Gador may or may not be a real place, but he seems to have been learning with his teacher in one of these big yeshivot with other people. And now that he's come home, now he's the teacher. And so the positioning has changed as well. He's come home now to share his Torah with his people. So, and we know that because it's Iro, it's his city. So miyad nichnas Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. So now he entered, and where did he enter? So the English translation actually adds this. He entered now the study hall in the town, v'darash, and he taught. La'olam yehei adam rach kekaneh v'al yehei kasher ke'erez. A person should always be soft like a reed and not stiff like a cedar. And this is the line that we opened with. And the story puts this line into Rabbi Elazar's mouth. So what's the application of this saying to the story? Who is the cedar and who is the reed, and in what way? What do people think? And I will say that the Koren translation, which often adds things to make it make sense in the Talmud, adds to that line, a person should always be soft like a reed and not stiff like a cedar, because one who is proud like a cedar is likely to sin. So that's their take on it, but I'm not sure that that's the only take. So who is the cedar and who's the reed here?
Sorry, I'm not sure if you touched on this already, but I think it's really fascinating that the whole miyad, that he goes straight away back into the Beit Midrash to learn this lesson. So he's just come from a place of learning, and now he's gone back, and what he's learning presumably is actually applicable to his interaction with this person.
Yes. So the Beit Midrash frames the story in a really powerful way. He comes from the Beit Midrash, and the Beit Midrash seems to be what causes him to have that level of arrogance that he insults someone. And now he's bringing that lesson back with him into the Beit Midrash, and he's immediately reflecting on it, right? So it does give us a sense that he's learned his lesson, but not only that, it's almost like he's telling his students, guys, I've realized this thing, when we're learning Torah, it keeps us detached from real people in the real world. So here's my teaching to kind of help us address this tendency among people who sit and learn and are detached from the real world all the time. So he's not only learned his lesson, he's sharing it with his students, for sure. So, but in what way he's learned the lesson? But Galit, if I asked you, I'll just put you on the spot because no one else is answering. What is the reed and the cedar analogy in the story?
To be honest, the first thing that comes to my mind is that what we talked about before, about the reed kind of moving with things and being, I don't know, the imagery is almost flexible, or rolls with the punches in a sense.
Yeah.
So to me, in the, just from I guess the basic reading, the ugly man, as we'll call him, is more inflexible, but maybe in a way, Rabbi Elazar's thinking initially was more inflexible, and then he's learnt to become. I don't think it necessarily is one or the other. I think that
So one of my favorite movies is The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So I don't know if this reference will be meaningful to anyone, but in the opening song, it ends with this like very dramatic statement, like who's the monster and who's the man. And the point is that the person who looks like the monster in the actual physical hunchback is not at all a monster. And who's the monster is the person who's supposed to reflect like religious authority and spirituality. So whether or not that reference means anything to anyone. So I think the question of who's the cedar and the reed is supposed to be ambiguous here. So I agree, Galit, that there's, and you basically summarize like both options. It could be that the inflexibility of the cedar is actually reflected in the ugly man's stubbornness, in his inability to accept the apology, and that there's a little bit of a critique of that, although the story is understanding of his hurt and offense, but also at the same time asking us to accept and acknowledge when other people have made an effort to change. So maybe he's the inflexible one. But certainly another very obvious reading is that Rabbi Elazar is the cedar and he should have been like the reed. And that's the soft and the hard. Maybe the soft and hard is about sensitivity and insensitivity. Yeah, Yafa?
Also, I think the metaphor you mentioned earlier, and like I have the imagery of like the Prince of Egypt when like Batcher's getting Moses from the Nile, like that scene in my brain, but like that imagery that is consistently repeated of the reeds being associated with water and then water being Torah. So it's whoever's in the, like, I don't know if it's a specific like metaphor that matches each individual, but maybe it's that the reed is the person who's understanding the intention of the Torah and acting the way that they're supposed to in this context, and the cedar is the person who's not actually like able to internalize what the Torah is trying to teach us and the actual messaging. So like spend however much time you want in a Beit Midrash, but if you don't understand how that Beit Midrash translates to your actual life, then you're going to still be a cedar irrespective of how much time you spend in the water.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that being in the water, being grounded in Torah is a really powerful message as well. Yeah, Safta or my dad, I don't know who. Are you unmuted? Oh, there we go. Yeah. I can't hear you. You might have to go a bit closer.
But why is the discussion about who is what? Because he's saying a person should be like a reed and not stiff like a cedar. So, and with all due respect to Rabbi Elazar, the notion that he's gotten that far to reflect on anything except himself in this whole thing seems a little bit of a stretch.
Right. So
he's saying, you know, he's basically reflecting on his own experience, his own behavior and his own experience in particular. And it's basically, you know, it's an advertisement for mindfulness that, you know, that he was outside of the Migdal door, but he was behaving as if he was still there.
So maybe the image of flexibility.
He wasn't being flexible about the change in environment, that he was out in the world and that confronted now with a whole different set of circumstances. Needed to be in the moment. And the moment clearly called for a different response. But he was annoyed that what was being asked of him was at odds with where he would like to have thought himself to be, which is in his head still in a different way.
So maybe the flexibility metaphor is about how you adapt to your surroundings, and he was so clearly not realizing that he was in the real world and no longer in the Beit Midrash, and that's the lesson that he's learned. Yeah, Avi?
Just reflecting, and this is maybe a sort of meta reflection as well as a reflection specifically in this context, that we often, like in Talmudic stories, go to metaphors. You know, for example, in this case, we've got the cedar, we've got the reed, and if we want, we could introduce a third, which would be, let's say, a leaf, with the idea being that a reed is rooted but flexible, a leaf would be flexible, overly flexible, but not rooted, and a cedar is rooted and inflexible. And maybe like the question always comes back to, obviously that sort of middle path is best just because of the way we set up the metaphor. But the question really is like, we're discussing what are the parameters, like what makes someone a reed? What is reed-like behavior? And when does behavior translate to be cedar behavior or leaf behavior, for example?
Yeah. And I think the story is really asking for its readers to reflect on what would be the right character traits to cultivate. And that seems to be the man's message, is cultivate the right character traits so that you're not accustomed to behave like this. And we don't really get an answer or like a list of, you know, what's the solution, like how should we be? But the imagery of the reed, of the flexibility, but also the softness and the sensitivity and the adaptability to our surroundings, I think are hinting us in the right direction. So just the last line, I think, really reinforces this. So, and this is also, we already read, and then it gets repeated, although in a slightly different form. Which is the quill. So the reed merited that we use a quill for it to write. And last time we had Tanakh, and this time it's Torah, Tefillin, and mezuzah. I don't really have a reflection on why that statement has changed from the beginning to the end, but it's a repetition. And I think we get now a really powerful sense of why it's so important that we use a reed to write a Torah with, because it's Torah that can, or in the case of Rabbi Elazar, did lead a person to this level of arrogance and self-centeredness that we need to be countering. And so we're using the reed to write a Torah with, to sort of imbue our Torah with that sensitivity or that flexibility or whatever it is that the reed represents in the very words that Torah is written with, which I think is really powerful. So just because I'm aware we've reached time, I think it's obvious there's some messages here around a Teshuva process and what forgiveness entails. I think the first half of the story really does bring home that importance of emotional intelligence in our Teshuva process, and the man's message about basic human dignity should really be central to our religious lives, so that to impugn another creation is to impugn God. And so a truly religious person is one who sees and appreciates the divine image in all the people they meet. And of course, this can be really hard. And we talked in the beginning about what those involuntary reactions that we can have to perceived ugliness. And so the rabbis formulated a bracha, which we won't reflect on in detail, but a bracha that's supposed to be said when you see a person of unusual appearance, which is, I think, a ritual moment which is designed to help us to recognize that difference in other human beings is a blessing and an emanation of the divine. And although that's not the central direction that we went in tonight, I think it's worth noting that this story has been used by Jewish disability advocates, I think on which Avi is an expert, to demonstrate the centrality of human dignity in Jewish theology. And I have to say that I've been thinking about our perceptions of beauty and physical beauty and strength and achievement when watching the Paralympics recently and watching people achieve really incredible things with different levels of ability and challenges. But the second half of the story, I think, focuses us on the limits or the boundaries of forgiveness. So when do we accept apologies graciously, and when do we refuse the gesture, and when can we rationalize or justify refusing forgiveness? And what does it take for us to truly forgive others? Like, what process do they need to go through? So I think that idea of flexibility actually epitomizes what underpins the theology of Teshuva, that we believe that people can change. And that's a really important message in the Amim Noraim, that people are capable of change. And so I think that's also something that the reader's kind of representing. And without that conviction, the Yamim Noraim would be kind of meaningless. Like, what's the point going through a Teshuva process if people can't change? So we must believe that people can, and we hope that Rabbi Elazar has changed by the end of the story, although we don't have any proof. But I think, again, just back to that first idea about the danger of Torah study, like, most of us are not full-time Torah scholars, so we might think we're immune to the sort of self-centeredness that Rabbi Elazar displays as a result of his intellectual achievements. But I have been thinking a lot about how COVID lockdowns and isolation force us very inward. So to spend a lot of time in our own heads and a lot of emotional energy invested in looking after ourselves physically or financially or emotionally or whatever it takes to just get through it. And that can make us maybe a little bit detached from the needs of others. And there were plenty of memes and jokes after the last lockdown about how we might have all forgotten how to interact with other people and just lost our social skills altogether. And as funny as that was, like, I think there's a little bit of a kernel of truth there in terms of what a lockdown can do and extended periods of time being detached from other people. So I think, and Yamim Noraim are going to be particularly weird. Those of us in Sydney, this will be our first time. And if you're in Melbourne, I know it's your second time doing Yamim Noraim from home. And of course, there's an extra level of very strange self-centeredness to that, because Yamim Noraim for most of us for the rest of our lives has been a very communal experience that you connect with other people in a shul context or in a meal context. So I guess that this year, I think the ultimate lesson amongst all the stuff that we've discussed that I'm taking from this Talmudic story is to focus myself outwards, despite that internal and kind of huddled sense that lockdown kind of gives us, but to focus myself outwards and to embrace the sensitivity and the pliability of the read. Chag Sameach, everyone, and thanks for learning with me. Oh, I'm sorry, Karen.
Thank you.
Do you want to still make your comment, Karen?
Oh, well, firstly, I just want to say how much I appreciate all those great insights. And that was an amazing summary and a lot to learn from the end there. I just had a question, actually. I was just noticed that both at the beginning and the end of this piece, the reed has certainly come out on top as the better of the more desirable item than the cedar. Yeah. And I want to say, in this analogy, that fits true to what the story's telling us, but yet in the davening we often see the praising of Karazei Lebanon.
Yes.
And isn't that wonderful, like the cedars of Lebanon? Just wondering where that leaves us with for the poor
Well,
cedars.
I think it leaves us with some complexity. I think that's what's really powerful about the opening, which we didn't reflect on again, but the weirdness of saying that blessings are curses and curses are blessings, and it looks like a cedar is a good thing, but maybe it's not such a good thing. I think that's what the Talmud's always trying to do. It's trying to complicate our initial assumptions about the world around us and about people around us. And so, yes, cedars are amazing. They're beautiful. They're impressive. We can build impressive things from them that we can't build from reeds. And there's certainly, and we didn't do any of this, but there's a lot of resonance with what cedars are used for across Tanakh, literally to build things in and what they represent.
Yeah,
but this story is saying,
it's
well, that might all be true, but this other thing is also true. And so it's about holding those different things in our heads at once.
how and when you use each one.
Right, like a cedar might be useful to build stuff with, but you don't want to model your own moral.
There may be times when you need to be inflexible. You know, there may be things that
that's true. And this is not a story about those moments. And I think that's also the point about why narrative is such a powerful way to teach ethics, because you don't end up with one answer. You have different perspectives. And there might be a story, like Naomi said, where inflexibility is a good thing in the face of, you know, immoral stuff. So, and there's plenty of stuff about that across Tanakh and Talmud, but in this context, it's not a good thing. And so it's really about context and kind of complexity. I think that's like always.
I suppose it's what you were saying with our behaviour during the pandemic and how we have to think outwards and not inwards. It's also we want to be strong like a cedar during the pandemic and survive this whole thing. So there's a lot we can build in, yeah.
Yes, I definitely agree. Well, I mean, I'm happy to chat to anyone else, but thanks for joining me and Ochadash and Blake Street, and that was really fun. And thanks to everyone for contributing and making it feel like we're in one room. I don't like just talking for a long period. I mean, I like talking, but like not continuously. So so that was really fun.
We'll turn it over to Shelley.
Thanks. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your shiur tonight. As always, it's been a pleasure to hear you and to learn with you. And even though I feel like I'm interrupting your family chat and discussion.
No, please.
So sorry for that. But hello to all the family and friends in Sydney and Melbourne. And it's Sarah, I always find is very is very analytical in her shiurim and her teaching, but also really engaging and really entertaining. So that makes it fantastic to listen to and really great to be part of. And so I was also thinking not only about the Paralympics, I was thinking about a number of different things, including on Yom Kippur when we say all the al-hates, how many of them are about arrogance and about being stiff-necked and about being inflexible and all those sort of things. And that sort of resonated. I've got to say, when I was growing up, my mother used to point out those things to me in the machzor every year, which is but so I think that's kind of part of it, about how dangerous and how bad that is to have those traits and how it's important to work on overcoming them. And I was also thinking not only about the Paralympics, but there's been a show recently on the ABC or SBS called What Do Australians Really Think About? And one was about disability and one was about ageism and one was about obesity, and what people think about people who don't look like them or don't act like them or whatever, and you know, how welcoming they can be or how sensitive they can be to other people in those sort of situations. So all of these things. So as well as being engaging, entertaining, and analytical, Sarah is also very relevant in her shiurim generally, and certainly tonight. So on behalf of Or Hadash, and if I may, on behalf of Blake Street as well, thank Sarah very much, and thank everyone for their participation tonight.
Thank you so much, Shelley. That was really lovely. Yeah, and thanks again to everyone. And I'll see you, you know, Melbourne people, when I can.
And Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, everybody.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Shana Tova.
Bye.
Shana Tova.